Hi everyone, welcome to Saxon's Hydrosphere. I'm Saxon and I love music and I love movies, and with this channel I wanted to create a space where both music and movie lovers can coexist. And today I am finally going to be doing my Queen discography ranking. Firstly, I just want to very quickly address that visually this might not be the most interesting video of mine. I'm not really able to use much in the way of footage in the background, as the Queen estate can kind of be a little bit ruthless with copyright claims, and I just kind of want to avoid that, so it's mostly going to be images that I'm putting on the screen here. So don't feel obliged to sit and watch this one. You can treat this as an audio experience only, wander about the house, make a coffee, do some laundry, go full Freddie and hoover up in a dress, whatever. Now, although I've not spoken much about them on my YouTube channel so far, Queen are one of my all-time favourite bands, probably my number one favourite if I'm objective about it. Not only are they hugely important and integral to 20th and 21st century British musical history, but they're one of the few legacy artists to have had the same lineup throughout their entire official discography, and would have continued that way if not for Freddie's passing. They were excellent songwriters, understood composition and harmony perfectly, they were unapologetically themselves and not afraid to take risks, and stretched the concept of genre to the absolute extreme, releasing music ranging from heavy metal to folk, arena rock to synth pop, and everything in between, all the while somehow always staying consistent and authentic to the overall Queen sound. I find that Queen are definitely an interesting one to talk about because I feel you can put 10 fans in a room and there's a high chance most of them will have a different pick for their number one album and favourite song, as well as having a completely different perspective to others on weighing the 70s and 80s output against each other. And also what's interesting for me and what made this list quite hard is that there's only one or two albums that I'd class as full home runs, since for the most part when you take away the huge singles and amazing deep cuts, most albums do tend to have a couple of duds in there or at least something quite fillery. So I found it really hard to rank these albums in terms of their overall quality instead of the ones that have my favourite classics, because for every The Show Must Go On there's a Delilah, and for every Bohemian Rhapsody there's an I'm in Love with My Car. Now, I'm only going to be discussing the official Queen studio discography from 1973 to 1995, so that won't include the Cosmos Rocks, as that's a Queen plus Paul Rodgers album, great as that record is though, which leaves me with 15 albums to talk about, and I'm very much looking forward to this. Something else of note too, this is the first and probably only discography ranking I do in which every album was released before I was born, which I think gives me, and of course the rest of my generation, quite a unique bird's eye view perspective on the entire discography, whereas if you take other bands I've spoken about like Rush and Iron Maiden, their discography was still growing throughout my time alive and as a fan. I find it really interesting the way in which different generations have vastly different perspectives on music simply through context of having been there or not at the time, and it doesn't make anybody right or wrong by any means, it just makes people experience and relate to music through a different lens, and the way in which that shapes opinions is very interesting to me. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the ranking. Number 15, the Flash Gordon soundtrack. Now I'm going to speed through this one really, as it was the pretty obvious choice for last place, with this being a full-on soundtrack album with only a few tracks being actual songs, and the quality of these songs is simply okay. There's not much to go back and actually listen to here, even though the main theme is a memorable earworm. Number 14, Hot Space. So I don't mind some of Hot Space. There are some pretty good moments across some of the songs where the funk and dance pop elements are used really well, but in most other areas it just kind of feels weird and off. Brian May and Roger Taylor weren't really completely invested in this particular direction, and I feel that it really shows in the music. The tight unity that the band was so well known for just doesn't come across, and it leaves everything feeling honestly a little bit like a production line, which is a huge shame. The standout track is, of course, though, the wonderful Under Pressure, featuring a duet between Freddie and David Bowie, which was a huge single before the release of the record, but nothing else on Hot Space reaches the same height as that closing track, sadly. Number 13, The Game. The final album on this list to be one that doesn't really do a lot for me. Crazy Little Thing Called Love and Another One Bites the Dust are of course staples in the catalogue. I do also love Dragon Attack for its groove and attitude, but most of the rest of this disc doesn't really do much for me in terms of sustained enjoyment. It's quite fillery in the second half and just not a very memorable listen for me personally. Not much else for me to say on this one really, it's kind of just there in the discography, not really doing much. So let's move on now to the albums that I do consider great and a big step up in quality from here on out. Number 12, Made in Heaven. Made in Heaven is the one record that seems to be written off by most people due to the history of its release after Freddie's passing, and that's something I'd also fallen victim to myself for a long time, having only given the album a proper chance 1 or 2 years ago. I understand people's mixed feelings towards it, and there are those who see it as distasteful, but I think people must have forgotten or just not been aware of the fact that this is what Freddie wanted. He was adamant in his final days that he wanted to record as much as he physically could for the band to be able to use, add to, and release after he had gone. Now, unfortunately, what does make this record a little disjointed is that he hadn't been able to record as much as he wanted to, leaving quite a lot on the cutting room floor, and only 3 or 4 brand new songs ended up making the final cut, with the rest being unused songs from previous album sessions reworked and expanded upon. But in terms of the actual music, there are some great songs on here. Let Me Live, for me, is one of Queen's most underrated songs, with Freddie, Brian and Roger all taking lead vocals across the runtime, a gorgeous guitar solo in the middle, and a wonderful choir spread throughout too. The title track is equally as wonderful and uplifting. I Was Born to Love You is explosive and lots of fun. And then of course you have Mother Love, which is hauntingly beautiful, even bone-chilling when taking into account that this was the final vocal performance Freddie ever recorded, and passed away before it was even finished, leaving May to sing the final verse. So yeah, there might be a few tracks that feel out of place or unfinished, even unnecessary when you get to Yeah and Untitled, but there are some incredible moments in here that I feel get written off a little too much. Number 11, A Day at the Races. I think from here is where the controversy in my opinions might start to arise, and don't get me wrong, Races being this far down does not mean I do not like the album. There are some great songs on here. Tie Your Mother Down is a fantastic opener, and Somebody to Love is a classic that has long been a favourite of mine, and there are some other standouts here like White Man, Good Old Fashioned Loverboy, and the very ethereal You Take My Breath Away. But other than that, I don't know what it is about the rest of the album, but although I enjoy it on a listen through, there's never really much that sticks with me afterwards. It's frustratingly kind of forgettable for me, which is a massive shame. I don't think I've ever had a bad time listening to it, it just doesn't leave any lasting effect on me afterwards. Number 10, A Night at the Opera. Here's where I get crucified for putting this one so far down, and don't get me misunderstood, this does not mean I think it's a bad record. If anything, it's a testament to everything else they've released, but I do think that this album is a little bit, I don't want to use the term overrated, but certainly seemingly just gets a free pass as a masterpiece just because Bohemian Rhapsody is a masterpiece itself. But when stepping back to look at the album as a whole, for me at least, it can be a little inconsistent. However, believe it or not, this was initially actually lower than Races before I had another listen through before doing my actual write-up, so let me explain the journey of my thoughts. Before getting into the actual songs, something A Night at the Opera does right is its musical diversity and its pacing. This is the record where the band truly went mad with bending genre and integrating many types of music, and the way these are spread across the album, however bonkers, actually really works. Right out of the gate, you have Death on Two Legs bleeding straight into Lazing on a Sunday Afternoon, and that massive shift in tone feels fun rather than jarring. I'm in Love with My Car is next, and was for me one of my bigger reasons for this album initially being lower, because these are some of the worst and cringiest lyrics from the band ever. However, when listening back to the album, firstly, lyrics aside, the music is actually great on this song, and secondly, I kind of realised that it'd be a bit hypocritical of me to dismiss a song just for silly lyrics when Fat Bottom Girls and Bicycle Race exist on an album that I consider one of the best. So I've come round on this song a little bit just for how good the music is. You're My Best Friend is a song I enjoy too, mostly due to nostalgia, as the first time I heard it was when I first watched Shaun of the Dead. I also really enjoy 39 for the more folksy feel, and Brian May's vocals are great here and really suits this style. Then heading into Sweet Lady, which is another cool riff-heavy song in stark contrast to the track that came before. The next few tracks, though, are where things start to get a little tiresome for me personally. Seaside Rendezvous goes back to the same vibe as Lazing on a Sunday Afternoon and is a little longer, so kind of outstays itself a little, and as much as I appreciate them going into a bit more of a progressive sound on the Prophet song, I don't really like that one either, as the pacing kind of plods along a little, and I don't really like some of the vocal delivery in the layered a cappella section. Love of My Life is, of course, a timeless ballad, but it's then followed by Good Company, which, again, I can kind of take or leave. And then, of course, you have Bohemian Rhapsody, which I don't need to talk about at all. It's a masterpiece in its own right and a cultural phenomenon, being one of the all-time highest streamed songs on Spotify and the only song, might I add, in that top 50 list that predates the 2000s. Finally, the album's capped off with God Save the Queen, which I think is a little redundant of an ending, to be honest, and the album should have closed off with Bo Rap. So there's a lot of good stuff in here, but also I think there are aspects that weigh it down more than maybe most would like to admit, at least for me. Number 9, Queen 2. This is probably where Queen get their most progressive, and although the cover art is globally iconic, I'm not sure there are many, if any, songs on this record that are recognisable to today's average Joe outside of the cult following this album seems to have amongst those deeper Queen fans. So like I said, this is their most progressive album and also seen as their heaviest. Lyrically, they're dipping their toes into a lot of darker concepts, as well as fantasy stories, which Freddie was a huge fan of during this time, and I believe had created his own fantastical world and lore that ended up making it onto the second side of this album. I really like the flow of this one a lot, starting really strong with an instrumental intro that's followed by Father to Son, boasting loads of harmony and an uplifting aura about it, and then building a lot of tension and atmosphere with White Queen, which Someday One Day continues to run with while building up the pace, closing off side one with the hard-hitting and bluesy Loser in the End, which is one of my favourite Taylor-fronted tracks. And then on side two, we truly dive into the progressive aspects and are brought into Freddie's fantastical world. Ogre Battle is a riff-heavy monster of a rock song leading into the very musical theatre-esque The Fairy Fillers Masterstroke and Nevermore, the former being very high energy and the latter being more emotionally driven. And then we go into one of my personal favourites on the album, The March of the Black Queen, probably their most progressive song next to Bohemian Rhapsody that constantly grows with riffs and harmonies flowing gracefully through each section of the track, leading directly into the very anthemic Funny How Love Is, which I feel first plants the seeds of the more anthemic stadium rock sound that the band would later explore further in the 70s. And finally being wrapped up with the extended full version of Seven Seas of Rhye, which we heard the beginnings of on the debut album. The only thing that keeps this one from being higher up for me is that certain things escape my memory after listening, which is unfortunate, and I just don't enjoy it quite as much as every other album I'm going to mention going forward. Number 8, Innuendo. This is the final Queen album to have been released in Freddie's time, and this is probably the album that has the biggest juxtaposition of quality for me, with half of the album containing songs I'd consider masterful, like the title track that almost has a Dio vibe to begin with, but grows into a progressive rock opus, which also features a guest guitar solo from Steve Howe, the magnificent vocal masterclass that is The Show Must Go On, and a return to the hard rock style with Headlong, I Can't Live Without You, and The Hitman. Don't Try So Hard is a great ballad, and I'm Going Slightly Mad is a lot of fun too, but in the midst of all that, I think there are maybe one too many filler tracks in here, like All God's People, and Sometimes I Can Take or Leave, These Are the Days of Our Lives. Brian May's blissful playing on Bijou is great, but that track does kind of feel like it's filling time a little bit, and Delilah is probably the worst song that Queen have ever released. So like I said, it's an album that for me probably has the biggest contrasting quality throughout, but some amazing standout tracks in there. Number 7, A Kind of Magic. The record that turned into the unofficial soundtrack to Highlander with 6, I think, songs being used for that film, and initially this was much higher on my list, making the top 3 actually, with it being an album that I do return to a lot. You have One Vision, Who Wants to Live Forever, and the title track especially being some of my all-time favourite Queen songs, as well as loving many of the deeper cuts too, like Gimme the Prize, and the very poppy and soulful 1 Year of Love and Pain Is So Close to Pleasure. But as much as I've always told myself that I adore this album, I have to be objective about it like every other Queen album and look at the weak links here, and while there are songs I do adore, I don't really think that much of Don't Lose Your Head, and I initially wasn't too fond of Friends Will Be Friends just because some of the lyrics are a little too sugary sweet and in your face, but it's grown on me a lot, having recently been in a situation myself where a friend has held me through some horrible circumstances, so I found myself relating to it, cheesiness aside. I also think the pacing in the middle weighs down the record a little more than I would have maybe admitted before compiling this list together. I think if a lot of the songs in the middle were rearranged on the track list a little bit, then it would be a better front-to-back experience. So the highs here are extraordinary, but there are some lows sprinkled about too that do stunt the pacing and the front-to-back experience of this record. Number 6, News of the World. I think this one is a little bit underrated and, at least in my experience, not spoken about as often as most other 70s albums. Mostly known for We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions, but as much as I like those songs, Champions especially for its vocal performance, for me personally a lot of the merit lies within some of the deeper cuts. Sheer Heart Attack is a killer rock song with tons of energy, and I'm glad this ended up on here after being a song that was intended for the album of the same name a few years prior. All Dead brings the subtle theatrical elements back and is a nice and quieter segue between the previous song and the highly anthemic Spread Your Wings, which is one of my personal favourites on the album. Fight from the Inside and Get Down Make Love take a more mid-tempo approach, the first of which being a Taylor-fronted bluesy affair, and the latter being more focused on rhythm and groove and quite sultry in mood. Sleeping on the Sidewalk is blues rock through and through, followed by the folksy Who Needs You, which is a deep cut I really love when I'm in the mood for something a little calming and gentle. And then we get into what I think is my favourite song on the album, It's Late, which opens with a tasty blues riff and builds into explosive choruses full of harmony and a powerful performance from Freddie, followed by an extensive solo from Brian May as the rest of the band bring the energy and tempo higher and higher until a massive crescendo after one final chorus, leaving us to be rounded off with the very tasteful My Melancholy Blues, an almost entirely vocal and piano-based blues jazz piece. My only issue with this one really is I think the track list could have been mapped out a little better, just switching around 2 or 3 songs here and there just to make the flow a little more natural, and I do think there's just a little too much of a focus around blues, which can get a little tiring and repetitive sometimes, but as for composition and songwriting, this album is fantastic. Number 5, The Miracle. I think this is probably Queen's most criminally underrated album and seems to hit the bottom end of most people's lists and written off as pretty fillery, but for me, I love this one. Still towing the line of mixing the pop and hard rock elements together perfectly, which is something I love most of 80s era Queen for. The production is amazing and Brian May's guitar playing is on fire on this album, and an element on here that I don't see get nearly enough praise for. Party and Khashoggi's Ship builds the attitude and groove right from the get-go. The title track I love for its very ethereal and theatrical atmosphere with all the orchestration, and then followed by the bombastic triple threat of I Want It All, The Invisible Man and Breakthrough, all 3 being incredibly enjoyable and energetic and some of my favourites in their catalogue. Rain Must Fall is a pretty decent deep cut carrying over the pop and dance vibe from the early 80s and again features a couple of great guitar solos from Brian. And then we have Scandal, which is one of my favourites of the 80s singles. The only song that I consider weak is My Baby Does Me, but then we're left closing off the album with Was It All Worth It, a rocking but wonderful and introspective song about life and sacrifice. The Miracle doesn't get nearly enough appreciation if you ask me, full of groove and attitude, great lyrical themes and amazing performances from everybody in the band. Now here is where we get into the albums that are almost perfect but might have just 1 or 2 songs that make it fall a bit short, and I'm going to start the top 4 with the self-titled. This for me is one of the greatest debut albums ever made. It's unique, bold. Looking back with the context of their wider discography, this is a clear blueprint for pretty much everything they head towards musically for the rest of their career in the 70s. The performances are outstanding and the production sounds raw and extremely impressive. Keep Yourself Alive is an immense opener and one of my favourite tracks from the early days. It's got such a great momentum to it, which then goes into a slower, more melancholic tune in Doing Alright, followed then by 2 amazing prog rock songs in Great King Rat and My Fairy King to wrap up the first side of the record. Side 2 opens with probably my favourite song on the album, Liar, an amazing and heavy rock song stacked with harmonies and interesting compositional movements. The Night Comes Down takes things in a calmer, more folk rock direction, which is placed at the perfect point in the album and a nice palate cleanser from Liar. And then we get to the highly energetic Modern Times Rock and Roll, the first song of many to be sung by Roger Taylor, and while only just over a minute and a half, still packs a massive punch, leading very nicely into Son and Daughter, which has to have one of my all-time favourite Queen riffs. So much groove and attitude in here, it's impossible not to move to. Then we have Jesus, which is the only song that I really don't like, to be honest. It's catchy in the absolute worst way, and I just really don't like it. And if not for this song, then this album would be perfect, closing off with the first incarnation of Seven Seas of Rye, which would later be expanded upon on this sophomore album. Queen's One is hands down one of the best and most overlooked debut albums of all time, in my opinion. Number 3, Jazz. Firstly, I think this is Queen at their most quirky and fun, with songs like Fat Bottomed Girls, Bicycle Race, Let Me Entertain You, and Mustafa, all either being very over the top in the best way, or quite flamboyant in polish and have some crazy musical arrangements. But there are also some really cool deeper cuts on here too, with the stadium rock anthem If You Can't Beat Them, Fun It, which starts to take things in a more disco direction that we see more of as the 1980s roll round. In Only 7 Days is a really nice folksy kind of song about a holiday romance, and Dead on Time takes the energy all the way up to a 10, quite reminiscent of Stone Cold Crazy or Brighton Rock from the Sheer Heart Attack days. And of course, Don't Stop Me Now is a staple classic in the band's discography, and again, one of my favourites. And to further contrast the energy and theatrics, we have three other slower paced songs in Jealousy, Dreamer's Ball, and Leaving Home Ain't Easy, which are all great tracks in their own right and help even out the pacing of the whole record. My only problem is I think that more of that jazz is a little unnecessary, and the album should finish with Don't Stop Me Now. Other than that, this is an incredibly fun and joyous experience. And one more thing I forgot to mention actually, Freddie's voice is very unique on this album. There's a certain raw edge to him that I don't think you hear on any other Queen record. Now, the final two on this list are the only albums that do not have a bad or filler song on them for me, and I'm going to give the number 2 position to The Works. Some of the album might be seen as trying to recapture things that have been done before, Man on the Prowl being similar to Crazy Little Thing Called Love, and the stadium rock sound coming back with Hammer to Fall and Tear It Up, but I think all these things are actually done better on this album than what they had done years before. Radio Gaga is a fantastic opener, and there's just something about the chord progressions and vocal delivery that emotionally resonates with me really powerfully. Then picking the energy up with the aforementioned Tear It Up, a huge rock anthem with some great call and response between the vocals and instruments. It's a Hard Life comes next, opening with a very powerful vocal and flowing into one of the best piano ballads the band have ever released, followed by Man on the Prowl, which, although like I said is clearly replicating the kind of Elvis Presley style that Crazy Little Thing Called Love did, I still think this is a great song and fits really well on the album. Machines or Back to Humans is probably the weakest song, but I still love it for the ridiculous vocal harmonies and layering all over the place, and there's some cool guitar moments in there too. I Want to Break Free is of course a classic and one of the first Queen songs I'd ever heard. I remember seeing the music video as a kid and thought it was hilarious seeing a moustached man in drag dancing around with a hoover, and I still love this song to this day. Keep On Passing That Open Window has some amazing piano work and is produced immaculately. Hammer to Fall brings that stadium rock sound back again and is one of my favourites in this style. Lots of attitude and vocal harmonies and more amazing guitar work from Brian May. And finally closing things off with Is This the World We Created? A beautiful acoustic song about all the horrible things we see across the world, leaving the album on a really poignant note. There's not a bad song on this album, but there is one more album that does things even better. Number 1, Sheer Heart Attack. Aside from Hot Space and Flash Gordon, Sheer Heart Attack was the only other album on this that I knew exactly where to put going into writing this and didn't shift its position once. And for me, the only other Queen album that is a total blast from start to finish with not a single song I do not like. There are a couple of songs that I wouldn't choose to listen to on their own, like Dear Friends and She Makes Me, but in the context of a front-to-back listen, these sit really well and don't upset the overall experience. For me, this album is Queen perfection, truly stretching genres to the absolute limit and doing so with complete conviction. Brighton Rock is a ferocious opener of a rock song with a massive gap in the middle for Brian May to rip solos and shine. Killer Queen is a power pop rock classic that I never ever get tired of hearing. The triple threat of Tenement Funster, Flick of the Wrist and Lily of the Valley is always a joy and a miracle that these three blend together so perfectly, being very distinctly different stylistically, with Flick of the Wrist being one of my all-time favourites from the more progressive side of the band. Now I'm Here is another belter with lots of energy and is home to one of Brian May's finest 70s riffs. In the Lap of the Gods then opens up with Roger Taylor wailing like a banshee and goes into a more interlude-y type song that feels quite theatrical in places and bleeds very nicely into Stone Cold Crazy. This is one of Queen's most energetic songs and I distinctly remember my first time hearing this one. Around the time I was still quite young and my only exposure to the band were a few of the bigger and more accessible singles, so I was absolutely bemused that this was the same band who had released those songs like Break Free and Radio Gaga. Dear Friends is a nice palate cleanser after the breakneck Stone Cold Crazy, which leads very pleasantly into Misfire, a personal favourite deep cut of mine with some lovely stacked harmonies on the guitar, as well as many vocal layers flying around too. And then if things hadn't been bonkers enough, we get the very flamboyant show tune style song Bring Back That Leroy Brown, which I have always found incredibly fun to listen to. And finally, to wrap things off, we're given a very soft tempo song in She Makes Me and a reprisal of In the Lap of the Gods. For me, this whole album experience is a journey unlike any other Queen record and balances the madness and genre stretching excellently, and a total blast from beginning to end that I never get tired of. So that wraps up my Queen discography ranking. I'm sure yours is very different to mine and will have some very different opinions to me, so I want to hear about them down below in the comments. Thanks for watching. Please remember to subscribe to the channel and like the video and share with all your Queen-loving friends. As for my song of the day, I'm going to go with Ballet to the Masses by A Joker's Rage, which is a tribute to Freddie Mercury himself, and I'll leave a link in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.